So, final render settings. I'm going to go to the beauty robot. This is going to be the most important one. One thing I want to do is I would also like to, let's at this point see how this is looking. Let's go open the render view and do a render of this. We have everything here except for the sparks. As we mentioned before, it's going to be rendered separately and we can add them later with more control. The main thing for me here is that even though we have these spots of light coming from the exception particles that we decide to consider to add to our scene, and it's going to be really cool for having some more dynamic lighting coming from connecting well with the blast effect. It would be interesting for us at least to give it a try of considering having those particles present here as well as a phantom element. So for the sake of testing that, I'm going to create a copy of this so we don't change those settings there. And I'm going to go to the render robot. I'm not going to use the instances of light for now. And these LGTRS particles, I'm also not going to be using them as candidates. And for now, I'll just use LGT dome and LGT sphere. So let's do a baseline render, so we know where we're starting from. So now we just have dome and the sphere light. The idea was, what I was wanting to test was having these RNDR blast particles to be present as a phantom. Control C, Control V. This means they will not be visible to the render, but they will be interacting with everything else on the scene. And you can see right away how much different the render is going to look if we include the particles for reflection purposes. When you feel like this is that much different, I think it makes sense for us to actually do this part of the reflection of the particles as a separate pass. Okay, where we're just going to be focusing on the reflection. So let's go here to the beauty robot or to the AOVs. I'm actually going to be creating an AOV for this specific AOVs for this one. So make sure to reference the second one, AOVs 2. And the only thing I want on these, let's simplify as much as we can. I'm going to start from scratch. And let's just get the reflection. Diffuse, we'll get just the reflections. And let's do a render. And now here we should have reflection. And this is the only thing that we're interested in, just the reflection. Okay, and this is something that we can then add to our render. So we're going to be rendering without the particles in the reflection, just having those exception um, light elements of particles affect the overall rendering. This seems too overwhelming for the colors of our mesh and all that, but it will probably be an interesting effect, an interesting layer to add to our composition. Okay, so I'll call this tech robot or particles reflection or blast reflection. And I think the settings for this render don't need to be as high as we'll have on the other ones. I'm going to close this window and let's start testing things out to make sure we have enough sampling for the final resolution renders. So again, I'll start with the baseline render. At this point, it makes sense for us to be rendering this at full resolution. So going to the main and rendering again. Want to make sure we have all the detail and as little noise as we can. Overall, it's pretty clean. The areas that are giving us a bit more noise are here, maybe here as well. We can try and identify where that's coming. If we go to diffuse particles or specular particles, I'm betting that's going to be where it's coming from, so not here. Reflection particles. Okay, the reflection is what has most noise apparently. Let's check out the whole thing. Yeah, definitely the reflection for everything. So let's try and increase the quality of this one. So going into the beauty robot, going into the sampling tab. So these values are also very low. These are not final values. So I'm gonna put this to 0.01 and increase the maximum samples to 128. And let's see what that gives us. Also start turning on the motion blur so that we can make sure we have enough samples on everything. And this might take a bit longer, but it's still very fast either way. But I think it should give us a much better result than what we currently have. So it's now rendering. The fact that we have some motion blur on will also help clean up some of that noise because it tends to be blurred out a bit. So this area is already looking better, a bit noisy still. So I think this area is a good test subject. I'm going to stop the render now and select a region that seems more relevant. So something around here. If we can clear the noise that we have on this area with this motion blur, then we should be in a good place. And this should be faster to render. I'm going to save this one so that we can compare. Minimize. And one thing we can do is here on the sampling, we know that most of the noise is coming from the reflection. So we can go to the override and on the reflection, override samples. And on the samples, let's put this at 64. One thing that can also save us some time is the trace depth. If you go to global, the trace depth for the reflection, maybe we can bring it down to 2. Unfortunately, I don't see any difference. So let's see if we can improve the sampling of these lights, the mesh and the sparks. So I think on the electric, we were already adjusting this. So here on the contribution, we were at 64. Let's increase this to 128. I'll do the same thing for the sparks, 128. And on the render node, let's change the maximum samples to 256. And let's give it another try. So if we compare with the previous one, this is what we had before. Let me put this at 200. Before and after the adjustments. I think this will be enough. The level of noise that we have here is going to be suitable for the quality that we're going for. Let's try another. Let's actually render the whole frame so we have an idea of how much time it's taking per frame. Okay, and this is what we get. It's a reasonable amount of time at this point, 2 minutes, and it's looking good. I do think I didn't remember to adjust the motion blur settings to match what we had on the particles, and that's something that we really want to keep consistent as well. But overall, these are definitely the settings that I'm going to be using for rendering. One last test that I'm going to be making is here on the beauty robot, checking the motion blur settings. We are using a frame duration of 1, so I'm going to bring this down to 0.4, which is what we were using for the blast, redshift motion blur 0.4. And the other thing is, why not try and just have actually more of the special particles on the lighting the scene. So here on the RNDR blast particles, here we had all of them, and here we had removed 80%. Let's remove just 50% and see if it holds up on the render. Now, of course, we need to bring down the intensity, otherwise it will have too much light on the scene. So I'll go here to the red one and bring this down to -5. And I'll do another test, this time with just going to override the resolution for this test. And the other thing I can do, just to make this faster, let's just bring this down back to 32. I think we're getting the same level of illumination, maybe even less, slightly less, but it's actually working for me. So I'm going to go with this amount of lights. It shouldn't affect our render times all that much. These are all point lights, pretty cheap. So I think this will work. The amount of motion blur that we now have seems more believable, and it should match better with the particles that we have. So this is ready to go. And on the next lesson, I'm gonna fine tune the render settings for the other passes. So see you on the next one.